The textbook in chapter 4 does a clever way of illustrating that in this increasingly knowledge-based world, a company's physical assets doesn't translate so much into how it's perceived or how its total value is perceived by investors. So I've got this updated chart that I built, and this was built in late August of 2015 when the stock market's going through some gyrations, so the numbers may change. And what you see is that a company that's more commonly associated with intellectual property has a much higher ratio of its market value to its book value, which is more of what the hard assets. And frankly, in Apple's case, it would be a much higher number, like 8 or 9 to 1, except Apple keeps so much cash on the books and that's a hard asset. So you see that these intellectually prized companies have much higher valuations in the market. Now, in Apple's case, it isn't just so much their intellectual capital, it also has to do with their brand reputation and the like. Then you see ExxonMobil, which is a company that brand-wise, it exists, but it deals in a commodity, and that would be the oil and gas markets. So you can see that fairly low ratio of market to book. In other words, the physical assets for ExxonMobil tie pretty closely to the actual market capitalization is measured in the stock market. And then you have Delta Airlines in the middle, where yes, there's some brand equity, yes, there's some recognition that it has some unique processes, but it also is an asset-intense environment. So increasingly, the most valuable firms are not necessarily tied to hard assets, they're tied to intellectual assets. So let's talk about the firm's leading intellectual asset, and that's people. Now, I'm not going to try to replicate what you learned in your organizational behavior class. I'm just going to put a little bit of a strategic sense to it. So there's this idea of firms need to possess human capital. Absolutely agree. Then you get into this interesting question of what's most important, attracting, developing, or retaining? And the answer is obviously all three are important. When you look at a firm and you say they have a great workforce, is it that they are the best at picking them, or is it that they're the best at training them? And I think the answer is probably it's some of both. They may not pick always the best people, they may not have the best training program, but in the aggregate, those two of them work together so that they do produce the best workforce, and then they do a good job of retaining them. So human capital is what a person knows. Social capital is more of who people know, and it's those social relationships that connect together. So within a firm, if somebody comes to you and says, I don't know how to do this, and you don't know how to do it either, but you know who does know how to do that. You know the right person to call. And so that's part of social capital. Outside of your firm, it's what suppliers can you call to make that happen? What customers might be interested? Maybe what competitor can you reach out to for help on that? Believe it or not, sometimes that does happen in the real world. So social capital is a measure of who you know. And so that's very important, taking these isolated pockets of what knows, the human capital, and actually knitting them together into a really great organizational resource. That's kind of a recap. Incidentally, I don't dwell into the network analysis in kind of the later part of that chapter, but I think the idea of human and social capital is very important. So here's my question to you. Can you ever have too much human or social capital? And if you think about it, I bet your stamp answer was, well, no, you always want more human and social capital. The problem is you can't afford it. This stuff gets expensive. Can you imagine me trying to run a 24-hour walk-in urgent care clinic that's 100% staffed by board-certified neurosurgeons? I can't make that model work, even though 100% board-certified neurosurgeons probably would be great people to have staff a walk-in clinic. I can't afford to pay them the wage rate that they're going to need to make as a neurosurgeon if I'm going to make the business work overall. Likewise, you don't hire MBAs to staff the counters at McDonald's. You're not going to pay them what they need to make that happen. Social capital, it's expensive. How do you develop social capital? You move people around in an organization through reassignments, which is great for innovation, great for spreading, sharing ideas, but becomes costly because there's lost productivity as a part of the moves. You go out and you visit customers. Another great idea, but if you do it a lot, the staff loses the time in the office and you pay all the travel expenses. You send people to conferences. So you can see it just becomes expensive. And this is part of the art of the strategic management, is balancing where do I need my best human capital? How do I best develop that human capital? How do I best retain that human capital? How do I develop social capital? And what's the right level? These are all very strategic decisions. Now let me make this personal for you. Congratulations, you're on the last legs of finishing an MBA program, which means you have invested in your human capital, and I truly mean congratulations. Now my question to you is, how are you going to continue to develop your human capital? Are you going to join a firm that values your human capital, allows you to develop your human capital? It is going to also develop some social capital around you. For the most part, if you're working in smaller businesses, that's hard for them to do, and you're going to have to stay in charge of that. On the slide are some firms that are known for having excellent leadership development programs. And interestingly enough, some of the slides or some of the firms on the slide are not doing all that well right now. But I want you to be intentional about your career development, about your personal development, because ultimately you're the person that's responsible for it. I've got this last topic before we get into the wrap up. This textbook does a great job of talking about the balanced scorecard. Like I said, ultimately in strategy, it's all about sustained superior financial performance. So the balanced scorecard, there are 4 elements, the last of which is the financial indicators. They are very important. They too tend to be a lagging indicator. The financial indicators you have represent the decisions you've made in the past. Strategy is about continuing to make good decisions for the future, and this is where you get those other 3 elements. Customer perspective, what do our customers think of us? Are they becoming more and more loyal to us? What products are they most interested in? Internal business perspective, are we doing a good job of cutting costs? Are we managing our workforce correctly? Do we have the right sort of human capital on board? And then innovation and learning. Are we really preparing our products and our people to continue to lead in the future so that we will stay in the forefront of the industry? So these are more of leading indicators. These are the things you have to be doing today to have good financial performance some years into the future. Here's the trick with the balanced scorecard though. The financial indicators are easy to calculate. The remaining indicators are not very easy to calculate. Sometimes they're very difficult to accurately assess. For example, let's measure innovation and learning. Let's pick a good metric. Well, let's say we're going to measure how many patents we've obtained this past year. Well, when you incentivize patents, guess what happens? Your R&D staff cranks out lots of patents, whether they are valuable to the firm or not. So companies struggle with how do we measure these things, but that's no excuse for ignoring them. Some of you are going to struggle with this in BSG. You're going to struggle with making the right investments early in the simulation to reap the financial rewards later. And to the extent that you do a poor job with that, you're going to suffer. But ultimately, everything should show up. Your good decisions and your bad decisions do show up on the bottom line. So now let's take chapters 2, 3, and 4 and wrap them all up. And this is, what do we do with the analysis? With the external, this is what's happening around me. This defines my opportunities and threats. Internally, I've now figured out what I'm good at, what I could be good at, maybe what I'm not good at, and now it's time to make some decisions. It seems obvious that I would always take my strengths and match them to opportunities. That may not work well. And you're going, what? How could that ever not work well? Let me give you an example. What is one of the greatest resources and strengths that Microsoft has had over the past 20 years? It is a software platform called Windows. What's the future of computing? Mobile. Windows OS for phones. They've been trying that for 10 years now, literally, in the smartphone market, and it's still not working very well. They kind of missed their window of opportunity, because when you hear about Windows 8 and Windows 10 on the phone, you get very positive reviews. But they just missed that opportunity because early on they were trying to match a clunky Windows software and put it onto phones, and they left other people to develop new capabilities called Android, called iOS, that were leaps and bounds ahead of that. So you can't always match your strengths to the opportunities, because maybe it's not going to be a good fit. Typically you do buffer the threats, and typically you do have to fix the weaknesses that are crucial to the future. So that's where your forecasting and your analysis comes in. So to wrap up, in terms of the internal analysis, we're about figuring out what we're good at, what we're not good at, and how can we make those things valuable, rare, and hard to imitate for. The internal-external analysis put together set the stage for what comes next in the course, and that is selecting a business strategy. Look forward to discussing that next week.